You know what's absolutely insane? There was a moment in World War II when a German officer broke into an American fuel depot expecting to find maybe a few weeks' worth of supplies. What he actually found made him physically ill, not because it was disgusting, but because in that single moment, staring at what the Americans had, he understood with absolute clarity that Germany had already lost the war, and the fighting hadn't even reached its peak yet. This isn't some dramatic Hollywood invention. This happened. And when you understand what he saw and why it broke him, you'll never think about World War II the same way again. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about the biggest war in human history. It wasn't ultimately decided by tactics or bravery or even technology. It was decided by something far more mundane and far more terrifying: fuel. Oil, the black liquid that makes machines move and armies function. And America had so much of it that a single forward supply depot, just one of dozens, held more fuel than the entire German army could scrape together in a month. Let that sink in for a second. One American supply depot, more fuel than the entire Wehrmacht could produce in 30 days. Now imagine you're that German officer. You've been taught your whole military career that Germany is the most advanced industrial nation on earth. You've seen the engineering marvels, the precision manufacturing, the brilliant military innovations. You believe in German superiority not because you're evil, but because everything you've experienced has reinforced it. And then you walk into that depot, and your entire worldview shatters. Let me take you back to 1944. The war has been going for 5 years. Germany has conquered most of Europe. Their tank designs are superior. Their tactics have revolutionized warfare. Their soldiers are experienced and disciplined. But there's a problem that's slowly strangling everything they do. They're running out of fuel. Not running low, not rationing, actually running out. Here's what that looked like on the ground. Panzer divisions, the most feared armored units in the world, sitting motionless not because they were destroyed, but because there was no fuel to move them. Imagine having the most advanced tanks on the planet and using them as stationary pillboxes because you can't drive them to the battlefield. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe in the early war years, was grounding more and more planes every day, not because they lacked pilots or aircraft, because they had no fuel to put in them. Picture this: Germany had fighter planes sitting in hangars ready to defend against Allied bombers, and they just sat there while bombs fell because flying them would use fuel they couldn't replace. Supply trucks that should have been moving ammunition and food to the front lines were abandoned on roadsides, empty. Soldiers were walking where they should have been riding. Artillery pieces were being pulled by horses because motorized transport was impossible. This wasn't happening because the Allies had destroyed everything. This was happening because Germany never had enough oil to begin with. And it was getting worse every single day. By mid-1944, Germany was producing about 1 million tons of synthetic fuel per year from their coal plants. That sounds like a lot, until you realize they needed about 5 million tons to maintain military operations at the level required to win the war. Let me put that in perspective. Germany needed 5 times more fuel than they could produce just to maintain what they had. Not to expand, not to launch new offensives, just to keep existing operations going. They were losing an unwinnable math problem. The Allies knew this. That's why American and British bombers specifically targeted synthetic fuel plants. Every time they hit one of these facilities, they weren't just destroying infrastructure. They were directly draining the blood from the German war machine. And the Germans knew the Allies knew, which made it even more desperate. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, later wrote that the attacks on fuel production were the greatest lost battle on the German side. Not Stalingrad, not D-Day. The systematic destruction of their ability to make fuel. Because here's what they didn't tell you in history class. World War II wasn't really won on June 6, 1944, when the Allies landed at Normandy. It was already over by then from a logistical standpoint. The Allies had already achieved such overwhelming superiority in fuel and supplies that German defeat was mathematically certain. The fighting continued for another year. Hundreds of thousands more people died, cities were destroyed, but the outcome was already determined by numbers that couldn't be argued with. Germany was fighting on fumes. America was swimming in oil. His name has been lost to most histories, which is almost poetic because what he experienced was happening to thousands of German soldiers. But his account, preserved in post-war interrogation reports, gives us one of the clearest windows into the psychological devastation of German forces when they encountered American logistics. Let's call him what he was, an educated Wehrmacht officer, probably in his early 30s, who had served since the early days of the war. This wasn't some fanatic SS true believer. This was a professional soldier who joined the army because it was what men in his family did, who believed in defending his country, who probably had complicated feelings about the regime he served, but convinced himself he was just doing his duty as a soldier. He'd fought in France, he'd probably been on the Eastern Front, he'd seen the best and worst of the war. And in late 1944, as Germany grew increasingly desperate, his unit was part of an operation behind Allied lines with a specific mission: capture fuel supplies. This wasn't unusual. German units were frequently ordered to seize Allied supplies because they couldn't rely on their own logistics anymore. It was a sign of how far things had deteriorated. The most industrially advanced military machine in Europe at the start of the war was now reduced to raiding enemy supplies like partisans. But here's what makes his story remarkable: what he expected versus what he found. He expected maybe a few tanker trucks, maybe a field depot with a couple dozen barrels, enough to fuel his vehicles for a few days, maybe a week if they were lucky. The briefing probably went something like this: Allied supplies ahead, lightly guarded, valuable fuel, high risk but high reward. So they went. The raid itself was probably anticlimactic. Maybe they found the depot less defended than they expected. Maybe the Americans had pulled back quickly. The specifics don't matter as much as what happened next. They entered the depot. And what he saw destroyed something fundamental in his understanding of the war. Picture this moment from his perspective. You've spent months watching your army slowly starve for fuel. You've seen tanks abandoned. You've seen planes grounded. You've heard the reports of synthetic fuel plants being bombed. You've personally experienced missions being scrubbed because there wasn't enough fuel for the return trip. Every drop of fuel has become precious. Your entire military is built around conserving it, rationing it, making impossible choices about what gets fuel and what doesn't. And then you walk into this American depot. The officer's own words, as recorded after the war, describe what he called an impossible sight. Fuel drums, not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of them stacked in organized rows that stretched farther than he could see in the depot. Each barrel marked, cataloged, ready for use. Tanker trucks, dozens of them parked in neat lines. Each one could carry more fuel than his entire unit had seen in weeks. Fuel pipelines, actual permanent pipeline infrastructure pumping fuel directly to forward positions. But here's what broke him. This wasn't even a major depot. This was a forward supply point, a temporary logistics hub that the Americans had set up just to make distribution easier to frontline units. And it held more fuel than the entire German army group operating in that sector could produce in a month. He said later that his first thought was that they'd somehow found the main American fuel reserve for the entire European theater, the central supply depot that fed everything. That made sense in his mind. This had to be the Americans' equivalent of Germany's strategic reserves, the absolute maximum they could gather. But as his soldiers explored the depot and examined maps and supply documents, the truth emerged. This was just one forward depot, and there were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, feeding a supply network that was so vast, so incomprehensibly large, that this ocean of fuel was considered routine logistics. The Americans were so flush with fuel that they treated it almost casually. German troops found maintenance logs showing that American vehicles were being serviced and refueled on schedules, not as supplies allowed, like clockwork, because there was never a question of whether fuel would be available. They found records of fuel being transported not because it was desperately needed, but to maintain supply chain flow, moving fuel just to keep pipelines full and depots stocked above minimum levels. One soldier reportedly found a memo complaining about fuel drums being stored improperly. Not that there wasn't enough fuel, that the abundant fuel they had wasn't being organized correctly. The German military was rationing every liter. The American military was concerned about proper warehouse organization of their excess. The officer stood there, surrounded by more fuel than he'd seen in his entire military career, and felt something crack inside his understanding of the war. Let me give you the numbers that the German officer didn't have access to, but that explain exactly why what he saw was so devastating. In 1944, the United States produced approximately 4.7 million barrels of oil per day. Per day! Germany's entire synthetic fuel production for the year was about equivalent to what America produced in 3 days. Read that again. 3 days of American oil production equaled 1 year of German fuel manufacturing. But it gets worse for Germany. Because America wasn't just producing that oil, they were moving it across the Atlantic Ocean through U-boat-infested waters, protecting it with the largest navy ever assembled, and then distributing it across Europe through a logistics network that was itself an engineering marvel. The Red Ball Express alone, the truck convoy system that supplied Allied forces after D-Day, involved over 6,000 trucks running 24 hours a day, consuming thousands of gallons of fuel just to transport supplies. The system used so much fuel that if it had been a military unit, it would have been one of Germany's largest consumers. And that was just the truck system. That doesn't count the ships, the planes, the tanks, the vehicles, the generators, the everything else that needed fuel. America was using more fuel just to move supplies than Germany could produce for all military operations. The continental United States had massive oil fields in Texas, Oklahoma, California, and other states. American companies like Standard Oil and Texaco had been developing petroleum extraction and refining for decades. The infrastructure was mature, efficient, and enormous. Then add in the fact that America had secured oil supplies from Saudi Arabia and other regions. The U.S. Navy protected tanker fleets crossing both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Refineries ran at full capacity. Pipeline networks distributed fuel efficiently. And here's the thing that the German officer could see physically manifested in that depot, but couldn't fully comprehend. American industrial capacity wasn't just bigger than Germany's. It was operating on a completely different scale. Germany's synthetic fuel plants were engineering marvels. The process of turning coal into usable fuel was incredibly sophisticated. German scientists and engineers had done something remarkable, but it didn't matter. Because while Germany was creating fuel molecules from coal in complex chemical processes, America was literally pumping oil out of the ground faster than they could use it. Germany had cleverness and desperation. America had abundance and infrastructure. This wasn't a competition. It was a mismatch so profound that it determined the war's outcome more surely than any battle. The officer called his commanding officer on the radio. The conversation, pieced together from post-war accounts, is almost painful to read. He reported what they'd found: the fuel, the quantities, the organization, the casual abundance of it all. There was silence on the other end. Then his commander asked him to verify the numbers. Maybe he'd miscounted. Maybe the barrels were half empty or mislabeled. The officer confirmed, "No, sir, this is all real. This is all usable fuel, and according to the documents here, this isn't even a major supply point." More silence. Then his commander told him to destroy what he could and withdraw. But here's what the officer said later. In that moment, on that radio call, he heard his commander's voice change. The man had been a dedicated officer, motivated, pushing his men forward despite increasingly impossible odds. And in those few seconds of silence, something broke. Because the commander realized what the officer had already understood. They weren't fighting a war they could lose through bad tactics or insufficient courage. They were fighting a war that was already over. Had been over. They just hadn't known it until they saw proof. The German soldiers in that depot moved mechanically after that. They set demolition charges on what they could. They took some fuel for immediate use, but several men later reported that the operation felt pointless. You're trying to hurt an enemy by destroying fuel, and they have so much that what you're destroying is basically a rounding error in their logistics reports. One soldier compared it to trying to drain the ocean by removing a bucket of water. The officer watched American soldiers through binoculars from a distance at one point. This detail stayed with him. They were refueling vehicles, just routine maintenance, and they were casual about it, smoking cigarettes near fuel drums, which would have gotten a German soldier severely punished because of how precious fuel was. The Americans were laughing, joking around, taking their time. Because to them, fuel wasn't a strategic resource that determined whether their unit could complete its mission. It was just a thing you filled your tank with, like it had always been, like it had always would be. The abundance was so normal to them that they didn't even recognize it as abundance. And that, maybe more than anything else, made the officer understand the totality of German defeat. The Americans had so much that they didn't even appreciate what they had. It was just Tuesday to them, refueling vehicles, moving supplies, operating their massive logistics network, while every German soldier knew exactly how many liters of fuel their unit had at any moment because it was the difference between mobility and death. Let me explain exactly why what that officer saw represented an unbridgeable gap. Germany's pre-war economy was impressive. They had brilliant engineers, efficient factories, and educated workforce. If you'd asked any economist in 1939 which nations could sustain a major industrial war, Germany would be near the top of the list. But there was a fundamental problem that German leadership either didn't understand or chose to ignore. Germany had no oil. They had coal, lots of coal, and they developed synthetic fuel production to turn that coal into usable petroleum products. The Fischer-Tropsch process, developed in the 1920s, could theoretically produce all the fuel Germany needed. Theoretically. In practice, it required enormous industrial infrastructure, consumed vast amounts of coal and electricity, and even at peak efficiency, could never produce enough to meet wartime demands. By 1944, Germany was operating 25 major synthetic fuel plants, and they were producing about 124,000 barrels a day total. That's roughly 2.6% of what the United States was producing from natural petroleum sources. And those German plants were priority targets for Allied bombers. Every raid that hit a synthetic fuel facility removed capacity that took months to rebuild. Meanwhile, if the Allies bombed an oil refinery in Texas, which they couldn't because Germany had no strategic bombers that could reach America, the US had dozens of others that could pick up the slack. The asymmetry was absurd. But it goes deeper than just oil production. America's entire economy was built around petroleum. Gas stations dotted every town. Trucking was a mature industry. Automobiles were common. Refineries, pipelines, storage facilities, tanker fleets, all of it already existed before the war started. When America needed to scale up for war, they didn't have to build a petroleum industry from scratch. They just had to redirect existing capacity and expand it. Germany had to create synthetic fuel capability while fighting the war, build plants while defending them from bombing, train workers while losing men to the front lines, develop technology while under resource constraints. It's like trying to build an airplane while you're already falling out of the sky. The German officer saw the end result of these different approaches physically manifested in that depot. American fuel came from established wells, through established refineries, on established transport networks, to established distribution systems. It flowed like water because the infrastructure to move it existed and was mature and was backed by the largest industrial economy in human history, operating at full capacity. German fuel came from desperation, improvisation, and an industrial base that was being actively destroyed faster than it could be rebuilt. What the Americans didn't even know. Here's something that makes this story even striking. The American soldiers operating that fuel depot almost certainly had no idea how devastating their abundance was to German morale. To them, this was just their job: manage fuel supplies, keep the trucks and tanks filled, process paperwork, standard logistics operations. They probably complained about it being boring, sitting in a fuel depot while other guys got to see combat. Some of them were definitely annoyed about various aspects of their assignment, and they were literally, unknowingly, breaking the will of enemy soldiers just by doing routine supply management. There's something almost darkly comical about it. German soldiers risk their lives to raid this depot, expecting to find a valuable strategic target. What they find instead is so overwhelming that it destroys their faith in their ability to win the war. American soldiers at the same depot are probably counting down the days until they can go home, writing letters about how they're bored, complaining about the food. Same location, completely different realities. This happened because America's industrial capacity was so vast that individual soldiers couldn't conceptualize it. They saw their small part, they knew other depots existed, but the totality of it was beyond their immediate experience. German soldiers, by contrast, were acutely aware of their supply situation at all times. Every unit knew their fuel status, every commander made decisions based on fuel availability. It was part of their constant reality. So when they saw American abundance, they could immediately contextualize it against their own desperate situation. The Americans just saw a lot of fuel barrels, part of the supply network, nothing special. The Germans saw the physical manifestation of their defeat. Different perspectives, same drums of fuel. Let me paint you a picture of what German logistics looked like by late 1944 to really drive home why that depot was so devastating. The German army was using horses, not for cavalry charges or traditional mounted operations, for basic supply transport. Thousands of horses pulling carts of ammunition and food because there wasn't fuel for trucks. This was the army that had pioneered blitzkrieg, that had revolutionized mobile warfare, that had terrified Europe with the speed and coordination of their mechanized forces. And they were using horses. In the Ardennes offensive, what Americans called the Battle of the Bulge, Germany launched their last major attack in December 1944. It was supposed to be a massive mechanized assault. Panzers would break through, race to the coast, split the Allied armies. The planning for this operation included calculations for how to capture American fuel supplies along the way because German logistics couldn't support the operation with their own fuel alone. Think about that. Their major strategic offensive, the one that was supposed to turn the tide of the war, was planned with the assumption that they'd have to steal enemy fuel to complete it. That's not a war plan, that's a heist that happens to involve armies. And it failed partly because they couldn't capture enough American fuel quickly enough. The mechanized spearheads ran out of gas, literally. Tiger tanks, some of the most fearsome armored vehicles ever built, abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they were empty. German soldiers walked past their own immobilized tanks. Meanwhile, the American response to the Battle of the Bulge included a massive logistics operation to redirect supplies. They moved entire depots worth of fuel and ammunition to support the counteroffensive. The same American logistics network that seemed so impossible to German raiders was flexible enough to completely redirect itself within days. This is what happens when you have abundance. You can adapt, you can respond. You can make decisions based on strategy rather than supply constraints. Germany's situation was even worse in the air. The Luftwaffe had over 3,000 fighter aircraft available in early 1945, 3,000 planes, more than enough to seriously contest Allied air superiority. But they could only fly a fraction of them on any given day because of fuel shortages. Imagine being a Luftwaffe pilot. You're trained, your plane is ready. The enemy bombers are coming to destroy your city, and you sit on the ground because there's no fuel to take off. That's not losing because of inferior equipment or skills. That's losing because the basic resources needed to fight don't exist. German tank crews had similar experiences. Your tank works perfectly. You're trained and ready. The order comes to advance, and you don't move because the fuel truck never arrived. Because there is no fuel truck. Because fuel doesn't exist. Modern war is about logistics. Everyone knows this intellectually, but experiencing it is different. And German soldiers experienced it every day. The slow strangulation of their ability to fight, not because they were defeated in battle, but because the resources to fight were being systematically denied them. Let's talk about what happens psychologically when you realize you're fighting an unwinnable war. The German officer who saw that depot didn't suddenly become a pacifist or a traitor. He continued serving, his men continued following orders, but something changed. When you know you can't win, when the math is clear and undeniable, you start fighting differently. Not worse necessarily, but without the same conviction. You follow orders because that's what you do. You complete missions because you're trained to do. But the belief that your sacrifices matter, that they're contributing to eventual victory, that belief dies. And warfare without belief is just violence without purpose. German soldiers in late 1944 and 1945 increasingly fought knowing they couldn't win. Some fought out of loyalty to their comrades, some fought because they feared what would happen to Germany if they lost. Some fought because the alternative was surrender or desertion, and the consequences of those choices. But very few still believed in victory. The officer who saw the fuel depot had his loss of belief triggered by a specific moment. He could point to the exact second his faith in German victory died. Most soldiers experienced it more gradually. Each supply shortage, each report of another bombing raid, each new restriction. Death by 1,000 cuts versus one devastating blow. Same outcome. Post-war interviews with German soldiers reveal a common theme. Many of them describe a moment when they understood the war was lost. For some, it was seeing American equipment for the first time. For others, it was news from the Eastern Front. For some, it was Allied bombing destroying their hometown. For our officer, it was fuel barrels. Thousands of fuel barrels, representing an industrial capacity so vast that German resistance was a mathematical impossibility. He couldn't unsee it, couldn't unknow it. And from that moment forward, every order to continue fighting existed in tension with this knowledge. He was participating in a war whose outcome was already determined. This is different from normal war fatigue or demoralization from losing battles. This was a fundamental understanding that the entire enterprise was futile at a structural level. Germany couldn't outproduce America, couldn't outsupply America, couldn't overcome the basic mathematics of industrial capacity. All the tactical brilliance, all the advanced weaponry, all the fighting spirit in the world couldn't overcome the fact that one side had essentially unlimited resources and the other was running on empty. That German officer's experience wasn't unique. It was representative of a broader realization that spread through German forces as they increasingly encountered American logistics. POW interrogations from late 1944 and 1945 reveal a consistent pattern. German soldiers were shocked by American abundance. Not just fuel, everything. Food. German soldiers were on reduced rations. American soldiers had more food than they could eat and threw away the excess. Medical supplies. German field hospitals lacked basic medicines. American medical facilities had supplies to spare. Equipment. German soldiers wore uniforms until they fell apart. American soldiers received new boots, new uniforms, regular replacements. One captured German officer famously said that the Americans could afford to make mistakes because they had so much material that errors didn't matter. Germany had to be perfect because they had no margin for error. When you have abundance, you can be wasteful. You can experiment. You can recover from failures. When you're operating at the edge of your capacity, every mistake is potentially fatal. This extended to how the armies approached combat itself. American forces could use ammunition liberally because resupply was reliable. If a position was defended, they could call in artillery and pound it until it was destroyed. If they needed air support, planes would come because fuel wasn't a constraint. German forces had to conserve everything. Artillery shells were rationed, air support was rare. Ammunition couldn't be wasted. Same battlefield, completely different resource realities. And German soldiers noticed. There are accounts of German troops watching American artillery bombardments and being awestruck at the sheer volume of firepower. The Americans would fire more shells in preparation for an attack than a German unit would receive for an entire month of operations. It wasn't that German soldiers were cowards or that they didn't want to fight. It was that they were being asked to hold back an avalanche with their hands. The fuel depot was a microcosm of this larger reality, one small piece of evidence that revealed the entire imbalanced equation. Germany was fighting with brilliance and desperation. America was fighting with resources and systematic application of industrial power. And there's no amount of brilliance that can overcome a 10-to-1 or 20-to-1 or 100-to-1 resource disadvantage sustained over years. Here's something that makes this story even more tragic from a German perspective. Hitler was repeatedly told that Germany couldn't sustain the war effort against American industrial capacity. His own economic advisors, his generals, his armaments ministers, they all provided data showing that the math didn't work. Albert Speer, probably the most capable administrator in the Nazi government, explained in detail why Germany was losing the production war. Hitler's response was essentially to deny reality and insist that willpower and fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. He gave speeches about how German soldiers were superior to American soldiers, how German engineering was better, how ideological commitment would triumph over decadent materialism. And in tactical situations, he was sometimes right. German soldiers often were better trained in 1944. German tanks like the Tiger and Panther had advantages over most Allied armor. German engineers did create remarkable weapons, but none of it mattered because you can't fight without fuel, can't move supplies without trucks, can't produce weapons without factories and raw materials. Germany built a war strategy on denial of basic logistical reality, and German soldiers paid the price for his delusions. The officer staring at those fuel barrels understood what Hitler refused to accept. Material reality constrains what's possible. You can be the best soldier in the world, but if you have no bullets, you can't shoot. You can have the best tank in the world, but if you have no fuel, it's a bunker. And America had the bullets and fuel and everything else. Germany had fighting spirit and advanced technology and experienced soldiers, all valuable things, all insufficient things. The war wasn't decided by who had the better army in abstract terms. It was decided by who could field, supply, and sustain their army over years of industrial warfare. And that contest wasn't close. Let's talk about how the Allies specifically targeted Germany's ability to produce fuel, because this makes the depot story even more meaningful. The combined bombing offensive, the massive Anglo-American strategic bombing campaign, had many objectives: destroy factories, damage infrastructure, harm morale, disrupt transportation. But by 1944, one target set was prioritized above almost everything else: synthetic fuel plants. American planners understood that oil was Germany's critical vulnerability. Cut fuel production and you paralyze everything. Tanks, planes, trucks, ships all become useless metal without fuel. So they systematically destroyed Germany's ability to produce synthetic fuel. The bombing campaign was brutal and effective. Raids would damage or destroy a synthetic fuel plant. German workers would rebuild it, often working heroically under difficult conditions. The moment production resumed, another bombing raid would destroy it again. It was systematic economic warfare. And it worked. By September 1944, German fuel production had dropped to about 7% of what it had been in early 1944. 7%, not 70%. 7. That's not a reduction. That's near total collapse. This is why the German officer found that depot so devastating. His own country's fuel production had been bombed into near non-existence. Meanwhile, the Americans had depots full of fuel that they'd shipped across an ocean, through submarine-infested waters, past all obstacles, and still had abundance.
It was a visible representation of the complete victory in the industrial war. Germany couldn't protect their fuel plants from bombing, couldn't produce enough even when plants were operational, couldn't substitute other resources for oil, because oil is a specific chemical substance required for modern warfare. America had oil fields that Germany couldn't possibly attack, had refineries operating safely in the continental United States, had a navy that could escort tankers, had an industrial base that could produce everything needed to move and use that oil. The strategic bombing campaign did many things, but its most important achievement was choking off Germany's fuel supply. Everything else followed from that. When the German officer radioed back about the depot, His commanders already knew the broader picture. They knew German fuel production was devastated. They knew the Allies had overwhelming superiority. But knowing it abstractly and seeing physical proof are different things. The depot made it real. Let's bring this back to the human level, because it's easy to talk about millions of barrels of oil and lose sight of what that meant for actual people. For American soldiers, adequate fuel supplies meant reliable supply lines, which meant regular food deliveries, which meant they weren't starving, meant medical supplies reached field hospitals, meant wounded soldiers could be evacuated quickly. Logistics saved American lives even when they never fired a shot. For German soldiers, fuel shortages meant everything was harder and more dangerous. Supply trucks that should have brought food didn't arrive. Medical evacuations were delayed. Wounded men died from injuries that could have been treated if they'd reached a hospital faster. That soldier's diary entry from late 1944 described watching a comrade bleed to death because the ambulance ran out of fuel before reaching the aid station. The man's wounds weren't fatal, but without transport, they became fatal. That soldier died because of fuel shortages, not combat. Logistics. How many similar stories exist? How many German soldiers died not from enemy fire, but from the slow collapse of their supply system? We'll never know the exact number, but it was significant. The fuel shortage killed in indirect ways. Troops without adequate food became malnourished, weakened, more susceptible to disease. Soldiers without fuel to warm bunkers froze in winter. Units without fuel for vehicles walked everywhere, exhausted themselves, became less effective in combat. The absence of fuel cascaded into 1,000 different ways that fighting became harder, and survival became less likely. Meanwhile, American soldiers had relatively reliable logistics, not perfect, or as never perfect, but substantially better than their German counterparts. That difference wasn't just material, it was measured in lives. Every time an American soldier got regular meals, received mail from home, had adequate medical care, part of the reason was the logistics system that the fuel abundance enabled. The German officer seeing the depot was seeing more than just fuel. He was seeing the infrastructure that kept enemy soldiers healthier, better supplied, and more capable of fighting than his own men. That realization probably hurt more than any tactical defeat. Here's what's fascinating about this story. It's not unique to World War II. Logistics determines wars. Always has. Probably always will. Napoleon lost in Russia partly because his supply lines couldn't keep pace with his advance. The Confederate States lost the American Civil War partly because they lacked the industrial capacity of the North. Rome built an empire largely on superior logistics and road networks. But we tend to remember battles. We remember generals and tactics and brave charges and dramatic moments. We don't remember the logistics officers who made sure supplies arrived. We don't remember the merchant sailors who transported fuel across dangerous waters. We don't remember the factory workers who produced the materials. But wars are won by those people as much as or more than by soldiers in combat. The German officer understood this in that depot. His commanders understood it. German leadership should have understood it, but refused to. And it's a lesson that keeps being relevant. Modern militaries obsess over logistics because they've learned this lesson repeatedly. The US military's famous saying, "Amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics," exists for a reason. You can have the best strategy in the world, the most brilliant generals, the most advanced weapons. If you can't supply your forces, you lose. The American military today maintains enormous logistics infrastructure, not because it's exciting or glamorous, because wars are won by boring things, like supply chains and fuel depots and transportation networks. The German officer would recognize these dynamics immediately. Different technologies, same fundamental realities. But here's where it gets really interesting for the future. What's the equivalent of oil for modern warfare? What resource will determine the next major conflict? Some analysts argue it's semiconductors, advanced computer chips that run everything from weapon systems to communication networks, China and Taiwan produce most of the world's advanced semiconductors. If a conflict disrupts that production, it could cripple modern militaries more effectively than bombing could.
Others argue it's rare earth elements needed for batteries, electronics, guidance systems. China controls most rare earth production. That's economic leverage that translates to strategic power. Some think it's electricity and power grids. Modern warfare depends on constant power supply for communication, surveillance, command and control. Disrupt the power grid, and you disable everything that runs on electricity. The specific resource might change, the dynamic doesn't. Warfare is decided by who can sustain operations, who has the resources, who has the infrastructure to move those resources to where they're needed. The German officer in 1944 saw this truth in fuel drums. Future officers might see it in semiconductor fabrication plants or power generation facilities or battery production lines. Different details, same lesson. Let me give you one more perspective on what that depot represented. The United States in World War II produced roughly 60% of all Allied military equipment. Let that number sink in. Not 60% of American equipment. 60% of all Allied equipment, including British, Soviet, French, everyone. One country produced more war material than all its allies combined. American factories built 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, 2,000 ships, and millions of tons of other equipment. The U.S. supplied oil to Britain, to the Soviet Union, to all Allied forces. American steel production alone exceeded the combined total of Germany, Japan, and Italy by massive margins. This wasn't a war between equals where one side happened to win. This was an industrial giant fighting regional powers who couldn't possibly match its output. The fuel depot the German officer found wasn't an anomaly, it was typical. That level of supply abundance was standard across the entire American military because the industrial base supporting it was that massive. German soldiers were fighting the full force of American industrial might. And American industrial might in the 1940s was unprecedented in human history. It's not that German soldiers were inferior, it's that they were attempting to fight an economic superpower while their own economy was being systematically destroyed. The officer saw this in miniature, in that depot. Physical proof of an unbridgeable gap. America wasn't just winning militarily. It was operating at a completely different scale of industrial capacity, and no amount of tactical skill or technological innovation could overcome that disparity. Imagine being that officer one more time. You've trained your whole career for military service, you believe in your country, you trust your leadership when they say Germany can win, then you see something that makes all of that crumble. Not gradually, not through slow demoralization, instantly, in one moment of horrifying clarity. You understand that everything you've been told is wrong, that Germany can't win, that your sacrifices and the sacrifices of millions of other soldiers are in service of a lost cause. But what can you do with that knowledge? Desert? That makes you a traitor, gets you executed if caught, abandons your comrades. Surrender? Similar problems. Plus, you're behind enemy lines during active operations. So you continue, you follow orders, you complete the mission, you return to your unit and file your report, and keep serving. But you're changed, fundamentally, in ways you can't undo. This is the psychological cost that logistics can inflict. The German officer didn't lose because he was defeated in combat. He lost because he was confronted with undeniable evidence that combat didn't matter. The war was decided by factors beyond any soldier's control. That knowledge is its own kind of defeat, maybe worse than losing a battle. At least in battle, you can believe your efforts matter, that fighting harder might change the outcome. When you know the outcome is determined by industrial capacity and you've seen proof of the gap, fighting feels like going through the motions, necessary, duty-bound, but ultimately futile. How many German soldiers experienced similar moments? How many times did German forces encounter American abundance and understand what it meant? We know it was common because it shows up repeatedly in post-war accounts, interrogation reports, diaries, letters. The psychological impact of the supply disparity was as devastating as the material impact. Germany lost the war materially because they couldn't supply their forces.
They lost it psychologically because their soldiers increasingly understood they couldn't win. The fuel depot was where both those defeats crystallized for one officer and his men. So, what does this story really mean? On one level, it's a historical anecdote, an interesting moment from World War II that illustrates larger themes about logistics and industrial warfare. But on a deeper level, it's a story about the moment ideals confront reality. The German officer believed Germany could win. That belief was real and sincere, and then reality proved it wrong in the most undeniable way possible. We all have beliefs about how the world works, about what's possible, about what we can achieve. Most of the time, those beliefs aren't tested quite as dramatically as seeing a fuel depot that represents your nation's certain defeat. But we all eventually face moments where our understanding of reality gets challenged by evidence we can't ignore. The question is what we do with that information. The German officer couldn't change the outcome of the war, but his realization, multiplied across thousands of soldiers having similar experiences, contributed to the collapse of German resistance. When soldiers know they can't win, they fight differently, less aggressively, more cautiously, with preservation rather than victory as the goal. That psychological shift matters. In our own lives, the moments when we confront truths we'd rather not accept define us. Do we adjust our understanding of reality, or do we cling to comfortable beliefs even when evidence contradicts them? The German officer chose to accept reality, even though it was devastating. That took a kind of courage even if it felt like defeat. Hitler and German leadership chose denial, and that choice cost hundreds of thousands more lives in a war that was already lost. Reality doesn't care about our beliefs or our preferences. It simply is. The fuel depot was reality. Thousands of barrels of it, undeniable, impossible to rationalize away. And sometimes reality arrives in the form of something as mundane as fuel drums in a supply depot. That's what makes this story so powerful. The officer wasn't defeated in an epic battle. He wasn't overcome by superior tactics or weapons. He simply saw the truth. And the truth was sufficient. Germany had already lost. Everything after was just finishing what had been decided by industrial capacity, resource access, and economic systems. The fighting continued for months. The dying continued. But the outcome was determined by fuel, by logistics, by the boring, unglamorous reality that wars are won by supply chains and industrial output. The German officer understood this in that depot, standing among fuel barrels that represented an enemy so vastly superior in material capacity that resistance was mathematically futile. And in that moment, the war ended for him, even though the guns would keep firing for another year. That's the story nobody tells you about World War II. It wasn't decided by D-Day or Stalingrad or any single battle. It was decided in factories in Detroit and oil fields in Texas and on ships crossing the Atlantic. It was decided by workers welding steel and engineers optimizing production and logistics officers managing supply chains. The combat was real. The sacrifices were real. The courage on all sides was real. But the outcome was determined by fuel depots, by industrial capacity, by economic realities that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. One German officer saw this truth, and it broke something in him that couldn't be repaired. That's the power of logistics. That's the reality of industrial warfare. That's what they don't tell you when they talk about the greatest generation and heroic battles and military glory. The war was won by the side that could keep their tanks fueled. Everything else was details.